So today I'm having a conversation with Leo from actualize.org. If you haven't seen his YouTube channel, he covers everything from spirituality to philosophy and metaphysics, and we touch on many of those topics today. If you'd like to check out any of the things that we discuss in greater depth, he's got like 3-hour videos on just about all of them on his channel, but that's it for the intro. Let's hop into the conversation. All right, let's begin with psychedelics. You and I were just chatting truth, God, love, all of these things. And it seems like the way in for me in my life to all of those topics, which I considered hippy-dippy nonsense, was chance encounters with psychedelics that became purposeful encounters with psychedelics. Mm-hmm. So I know this is a high-level question. You can take it any way you want. But what have you taken from your experiences with psychedelics that have been most valuable? I know this is just a challenging first question.
The answer is everything.
Yeah.
Absolutely everything. Yeah, I mean, psychedelics have transformed my life so significantly, and my understanding of myself and reality and mankind, that it's impossible to understate, it's impossible to overstate just how significant it was. I mean, I've had such extraordinary breakthroughs in consciousness that are just absolutely superhuman. And when I have them, it's like my eyes are bulging out of my skull. It's like it's that level of intensity of understanding. I mean, I'm literally talking about omniscience of the entire universe. So, like, I'm not talking about just like having a trip or, even some DMT breakthrough where you encounter some entity or some angel or something, or some semi-religious experience. Like, I'm talking about literally anything you want to understand about the nature of reality as an absolute truth. Like, I've become conscious of that.
Mm-hmm. Can we slow down here? So this is obviously, I think, one of the questions that people have, and even I have, having some experience with psychedelics, that I'll sometimes ask myself is, the farther away I get from them, I ask myself, how do I know that that wasn't a hallucination? Because what I have is this memory of the experience and not the direct experience. So how do you cope with that, or answer that, or work through that?
Right. Well, that takes us into epistemology. So before psychedelics, I spent a lot of time thinking about the nature of knowledge. How do we know anything at all? That's what epistemology basically means. It's sort of a fancy philosophical word some people may not be familiar with, but it just means theory of knowledge. Basically, when I was in late high school and early college, for me, I had serious epistemic doubts about everything. Like, it didn't make sense to me how humans were confident that they knew anything about anything. And this, of course, goes into religion. I was very skeptical about religion and about God. Many of my friends were sort of religious, but I didn't buy into that because I was sort of a atheistic materialist at that time. But then I also started questioning, like, well, what is rationality, and how do we know science is true? Because, if we look at the history of science, there have been enormous epistemic, what I call blunders within science, like huge oversights within science, huge mistakes within science, which usually are not acknowledged by many people.
Can you give some examples of some of those?
Scientific revolutions have happened throughout history. In fact, there's a book by Thomas Kuhn. One of the most important books of the 20th century was written by Thomas Kuhn. He's a historian of science, philosopher of science, and it's called the Scientific Revolution, something along, those are the keywords, Scientific Revolution, something. And basically, he introduced the notion of paradigms. So, I mean, in science, we have paradigms, and paradigms are basically ways of thinking about reality or about a certain set of problems within science. And these paradigms, they evolve and they change, and there's a battle within science. So people assume that science is just like, whoa, we just go and measure some stuff and then we find objective truth. No. Science is way more complicated than this. There's a social construction aspect to science. Science is not just objective truth, the way that many, even scientists, make this mistake. It's really not that, because within science, there are many deep metaphysical and epistemic questions, like, what is the method that you're going to be using to understanding reality or to even doing science? See, people just assume that scientific method is just a given, something that mankind somehow discovered, or where did it come from? right? So these sorts of questions take us into epistemology. And really, there are many methodological issues and disputes within science, like how do you even know that what you're measuring and how you're interpreting the results, because you never just get a raw measurement, you're always interpreting the results, that your interpretations are correct, or the assumptions that you're bringing into the interpretations of your science are correct. And these assumptions, they change every 100 years or so.
So this is a little abstract, I think, for a lot of people. Is there an example that captures some of these assumptions, or what the unspoken paradigm might be? Right.
Well, I mean, of course, the best paradigm is that with Newtonian mechanics versus general relativity. Mm-hmm. With there was a huge scientific revolution that happened in the early 1900s with the development of quantum mechanics and with Einstein's development of special and general relativity. So basically, with Einstein, he realized in trying to understand what is space and time, because that was the problem he was working on. He was working on the speed of light. How do you measure the speed of light? What does it mean for velocities and so forth? And so up until Einstein's genius, why do people, even like as school children, everybody knew that Einstein was the genius. He's the prototypical genius. What makes him a genius? It's simply this, that he had such an open and fluid mind that he was able to question the paradigmatic assumptions of 2,000 years of, scientific exploration and history. And the Newtonian assumption was of absolute space and time. The idea that all of us, no matter where we are in the universe, are all experiencing the same time, and velocities are consistent, and we can all agree what the velocities are and what the times are. And then Einstein said, wait a minute, that's just an assumption. We've never actually tested that. We've never actually questioned that. And so he started doing thought experiments and questioning this stuff. And he realized, okay, so maybe time is not a constant. Maybe time is a relativistic thing. And then when he had that insight, other insights followed, and he was able to develop general relativity. And so therefore, literally, the idea of a static three-dimensional space in which we're in and a fixed absolute time, like right now it's a certain time for me and it's a certain time for you. No. The time for me depends upon how fast I'm moving. And the time for you depends how fast you're moving. And also our sizes change. Like people think, well, I'm 6'2" and you're whatever height you are. And people just think, well, that's just how we are. Everybody agrees that we're all the same height or different lengths or whatever. But what Einstein discovered is that no, like if you're going to be flying towards the Eiffel Tower from the top, like the Eiffel Tower standing like this, you're flying at it from the top like this, the velocity you're moving at is actually going to change the height of the Eiffel Tower such that there is no such thing as one height for the Eiffel Tower. Like this concept of the Eiffel Tower is X number of meters tall, this is a concept most of us kind of intuitively have. It's a sort of common sense notion. But as it turns out, it's not true.
Mm-hmm. And so this is I think important just to underscore that I've seen you talk in your videos that in this particular example is that size and time is relative to velocity.
Yeah.
Which is to say, we all assume that we can take out the same ruler and or tape measure or whatever it is and measure the Eiffel Tower and come to a quote unquote objective measurement. But really, that's because we're all moving at the same sort of velocity. And were we to move at very different velocities with the same quote unquote same tape measure measurement method, we would get different answers, which calls into question objectivity, calls into question all of these, the most basic fixed assumptions that you could make about the size of something, how much time has gone through, and then that causes you to go, oh my gosh, what else could be relative that I have considered as an absolute truth?
Yes, exactly. Mm-hmm. And really the history of human knowledge, and here, see, we have to properly contextualize science in a broader context of philosophy, because really science as we know it today is only like 500 years old. It came about with the scientific revolution in Europe, and that was really, it came from philosophy. It used to be called natural philosophy. That's what science used to be called. It was developed by people like Descartes and Newton and Leibniz and Galileo and these sorts of folks, and they did good work. It's important work. So it's very important to say here that even though it might seem like I'm criticizing science or I'm trying to undermine science at certain points, sometimes people get the wrong idea that I'm anti-science. Not at all. Science is extremely important. I'm very pro-science. In fact, the reason we're having this conversation is because we want to talk about how to improve science. So the problem is that science is always undergoing improvement. And of course, scientists, if they're good, they will admit this. But most scientists and most lay people don't understand the degree to which even modern science, current science, has many epistemic errors and assumptions within it, many also metaphysical assumptions within it, which are not strictly science. In fact, they're bad science. And so one of my missions with my work is to help to correct that and to get people not to be throwing all of science out in favor of some sort of dogma or religion, but just really seriously questioning what science is, because it's not an obvious thing at all.
Mm-hmm. It seems this is a good time to note that we often use science to mean two different things. On the one hand, we use it to talk about a body of knowledge, that we have based on scientific understanding. But science is also a method for coming to truth. And I don't actually know the answer from your perspective. Are you merely taking issue with science as the body of knowledge, but are 100% behind this idea of science as a way of coming to truth, this sort of hypothesis testing, assume that you could be wrong and try to break your assumptions? Do you stand behind that as a solid epistemological device?
Well, my answer is very, very radical. For most people, my answer is too radical. And that is that you actually can't use science to reach truth. Mm-hmm. Well, and then this takes us into what truth is. And there's different formulations of truth. There's relative truth. There's absolute truth. We can get into that. But there's the problem with the entire base of science as a knowledge base. There's huge problems there. I mean, there's probably, just even recently I've heard articles written that like something close to 50% of the scientific research studies and papers that were published like in the last 10, 20 years, later when they go to re-verify those studies, like 50% of them aren't verifiable.
This is particularly in the social sciences. So a lot of and I think you're very familiar with this. There's not just meta science problems, but there's very human problems of the publish or perish and the advantages that one gets to breaking new ground as opposed to disproving someone else's thing.
Yes.
If you were to labor and do good science for a long period of time, you'd probably make no breakthroughs for the entirety of your career, and that doesn't pay the bills. So what you find are people breaking new ground constantly with shoddy data or interpretation of data, because that's what gets them the TED Talk. And one of the most famous, not to bash her, is Amy Cuddy, who I'd cited many times talking about power poses and how, going like this, the Superman thing can raise your testosterone. And it was such an amazing, crazy thing to be true, and it was too crazy. It wasn't actually the case that your testosterone was affected by the pose that you held for 2 minutes. And she was taken to task, but first she made a lot of money and had one of the most popular TED Talks, and quite frankly, it might have been the good move for her career to not doubt her own wild conclusion in that case.
Yeah, I've heard of that case loosely in the past, and there's many of those cases, and it's, of course, we all know that it's easier to bullshit in the soft social sciences than it is in the hard sciences. And oftentimes when I level certain critiques of science, scientifically minded people, they tend to be actually rather dogmatic in their positions about science, because science plays a crucial role in actually framing your sense of reality. It's not just the scientific method. It's not just how we, study certain things. Science informs where you think you came from, like what you think life is, what you're doing here. Science gives you a sort of a picture of like evolution. You evolved over billions of years, and you're just stardust. Where'd you come from? You're just stardust in the end. And so it's more than just raw data and research. It's a whole worldview, and people get attached to this worldview because either you have some religious worldview or you have a scientific worldview. Or really, there's not that many options here. Most people are not that clever about where they get their worldview from. They kind of lean more towards religion or towards science, and they just adopt it, and that informs how they live their life. But when I level critiques against science, the scientific mind is very sneaky, and it will start to defend itself This is what the mind is always doing, no matter if it's religious or scientific or atheist or theist or whatever. It's always finding clever ways to defend itself. And so one of the defenses is to say, well, everything Leo is talking about may be true, but it's only for the soft sort of bullshit sciences that aren't real sciences. But for the hard sciences, physics, biology, chemistry, maybe even include mathematics in there, logic, for these sort of like computer science, for these sciences, what Leo's talking about doesn't apply. And so I like to go to the heart of the problem, which is, let's talk about how physics is wrong. Let's talk about how chemistry, I mean, there's a lot of deep epistemic and metaphysical problems within physics, fundamental theoretical physics, like quantum mechanics and the interpretations thereof. And so this applies across the board. And also going back to your earlier question, it's not just the knowledge base that I have a problem with, it's the methods itself. The methodology is not questioned deeply enough. And really, most of the epistemic blunders come from the lack of questioning of the assumptions behind the methodology of science itself.
Let's go there. Let's take the hardest case, right? Let's take the underpinning. Let's go with physics.
Here.
Let's go with it. Yeah, let's take a hard
stuff.
Well, I think my audience is been taken mostly on board with, like, you know, people have their own agendas and they lie to you and you can't trust this and you can't, you know, there's a lot of low-hanging fruit in terms of skepticism. But let's go for one of the harder ones, it sounds like, which is the underpinning metaphysics, I suppose, you know, of this. So this is one that I actually don't know the direction that you're going to take it. What are the paradigmatic assumptions of the scientific method that are flawed?
Oh, boy. Where to begin? I'm actually writing a whole book about this. Part of my life's work is to help to popularize some of these ideas, which I've spent like literally decades contemplating and researching on my own. And I'm actually shocked at how bad most professional scientists and academics are on these topics. Generally, what I see is that most scientists actually, they're not in the business of questioning science or thinking deeply about science. They're in the business of doing science, which is a very different thing. It's sort of like the difference between knowing how to drive your car and being a good mechanic or engineer of cars. These are very different things. Like, your grandma can probably drive her car, but she doesn't know anything about how to fix it if it breaks.
Same with me. So
same with me. I get my oil changes. I don't do my own oil changes. I wouldn't know how. It's just easier. And so most people, the general population sort of assumes that, well, surely a scientist with a PhD who works at MIT and Caltech or Harvard, surely this physicist or whatever, he has a real good understanding of science. It's like, no, he has a real good understanding of how to do a very narrow set of experiments within a certain paradigm, within a certain subfield of his little narrow specialty within a larger bureaucracy of academia. And he's able to write research papers really well, if he's a good scientist, if he's successful, and he's able to convince his colleagues, he's able to, you know, discuss issues with them, but it's very narrow technical work. And just because you're good at doing that, and just because you get a Nobel Prize for doing that, does not mean you actually understand or have thought deeply about the nature of science.
Mm-hmm. So what are some of these paradigms that are going unquestioned?
God, it's such a deep question that it's hard to know where to begin.
One that, and I don't, correct me if I'm not on the right track here, but it's even, you know, ever since I saw The Matrix, one of the idea of an external world has always, the idea that we are measuring something outside of ourselves, when you could just as easily do the thought experiment that, you know, this could be a simulation, is the most simple way to put it. And to say, how would I distinguish between fantasy of my own mind, totally solipsistic, and it's just me, versus there is something outside of myself? And the answer that I don't know. I just, it's an axiom that I have, which is that there's a world outside of myself, and I treat it as separate from me. Well, but I can't prove it.
Right. So this takes us into the whole materialistic paradigm. Basically, modern science has a paradigm of reality, what I call materialism, or you could call it scientific materialism. Other ways of calling it would be, atheism also is a big part of it. Mechanism, reductionism. So basically, what do all these isms boil down to? All of them kind of combine together into the modern scientific framework or paradigm. it assumes fundamentally that the world or the universe is a objective thing that exists in 3 or 4 dimensions or however many dimensions, doesn't really matter. But it assumes that it's an objective thing which exists independent of our consciousness. And that consciousness or the mind is some sort of much higher level, much later emergent phenomenon that comes about billions of years into the evolutionary process.
So there's like 13 billion years of pre-existing universe, and then consciousness flips on whatever million or billion years ago, and we can, through whatever cosmic background radiation, figure out that there was a time when consciousness did not exist, and that it was just an emergent property of these organisms surviving.
Yeah. So another key assumption there is that consciousness is something that living beings do. So for example, if you tell a modern scientist or physicist that, well, what about a rock being conscious, they'll laugh at you, right? Because they assume that consciousness comes from the brain, from the neurons. Obviously, we know this. We can put an EEG on you and see that, if we shoot you in the head, your brain will die, and consciousness, all the indicators of consciousness will go to zero, and so yada yada yada. This is standard sort of materialistic explanations of stuff. And so there's an assumption that consciousness is something living beings generate, which turns out to be a flawed assumption. It's not really questioned very much. There's other assumptions. So there's assumptions that...
Can you talk about how someone might... I mean, if the answer is psychedelics, but I'm curious if there's just a thought experiment that someone can do to get to that level of skepticism that living beings aren't the only things that are generating consciousness via their brains.
Right. So... this gets very tricky. Consciousness is very tricky. So I have to issue a caveat here for the audience, is that at times it might seem like I'm making outrageous claims. Sometimes I make very radical epistemic or metaphysical claims about reality or consciousness, and you might wonder, why is he saying this? What is his evidence? What is his proof for saying this? And you might think that I'm talking from a position of dogma, as though this is some sort of ideology that I have or beliefs that I have adopted. So you have to really clearly distinguish here between beliefs or ideology or speculations you have, or maybe the way you think reality is, versus direct consciousness of what is actually true. So these are two very different things, and I'd like you to open your mind to the possibility that, yes, you can adopt all sorts of beliefs about the nature of reality, and those can be right or wrong. But what I'm really more interested in is direct consciousness of absolute truth, what's absolutely true. So most people don't have this even in their mind as a possibility, that you can have beliefs or ideas or scientific models on this side over here. That's one thing. And then you have direct consciousness of absolute truth, which is over here, which is a separate thing. And so just keep in mind that maybe this is possible. Maybe right now you don't know how this is possible, or why you can be so certain that it's different from this stuff over here, but it is possible. And so what I'm talking about is direct experiences of consciousness. And so,
I want to flag that as something I know that we're developing. But
so the problem with these conversations is that they're going to sort of multiply, and there's going to be all these different threads we can follow up on. But let's
just a flag to come back to is how does one know, directly, the direct versus what I think everybody, there's the map and there's the territory, and I think a lot of my audience goes, the map is not the territory, and I get that. How do I become the territory? How do I become one with it? So it sounds like we need to lay some groundwork.
Well, many people by this point are familiar with the map is not the territory. It was popularized by NLP and others. It's an Alfred Korzybski phrase. It's a great phrase. It's a beautiful phrase. It's an important phrase that many scientifically minded people don't fully appreciate, because most scientists, this is another problem with the materialistic paradigm, is that it sort of splits the map from the territory, and it works with maps, and it forgets all about the territory. Like, you can get so obsessive about making maps of reality that you just make maps and maps and maps. Just imagine a cartographer who spends his whole life just making maps. And then after 50 years of doing that, he even forgets that the maps correspond to anything real. He's just lost in the maps.
Yeah. And so for those of you who haven't heard this phrase, maybe it's the idea that when we look out, and you look out into your room or the world, that you have models of how things work. And, you flip the light switch and the lights turn on. And you often don't engage without all of that overlay, and because the map is useful for navigating a territory and it gets you to where you want to go, but we often forget, and sometimes can just, like somebody who's playing a video game and is just like I do with some of these games, don't even look at the video game. I'm in the bottom right hand corner just maneuvering through this map. We forget that there's a territory that it's supposed to correspond to.
Yeah. It's a very sneaky problem. It's a very big problem for scientists and for lay people as well. I mean, a really good way to illustrate this issue is look, we can be here, we could talk about Antarctica for an hour. I can describe to you all the features of Antarctica, the animals that live there, and the temperature, and what it looks like, and how beautiful it is, and all this sorts of stuff. And the audience could be listening to all that, and they have pictures in their minds about Antarctica, and they've seen it on the map, if they look at the globe and so forth. But none of that is the same thing as actually flying to Antarctica and being there yourself. Right? So that's the key distinction we're making. You can have all sorts of beliefs about Antarctica. You can believe it exists or it doesn't exist. Even if you believe it exists, that's still a belief. Now, you might say, well, but it exists. Well, you believe it does, but you've never actually been there. You don't know if that region on the map corresponds to anything real. And you might also discover that what you see on the map is very different from what you encounter in real life. Like, who knows what's really going on in Antarctica? I mean, it could be a tropical paradise there for all you know, and they're just the government is lying to you because they want to use that real estate for developing weapons or something. You don't really know.
And even beyond that, the map, there are assumptions baked into the map, which is that the shape of the landmass is what matters, and the reality of Antarctica is infinite. But when you get there, it might be the smell. It might be that there's no smell of a factory for 4,000 miles or something like that. So the map has implicit assumptions about what to pay attention to, and Antarctica just is, right? So you get there, and there's an infinite another amount of inputs that you could choose to focus on that might become more important than the shape of the overall landmass.
Yeah, and also you have to also notice how much detail is lost with a map or with a model. Mm-hmm. Like, compared to what you see on the globe, if you go to Antarctica, it's so much richer. It's infinitely richer and more complex than anything that a little picture of it, or even a 2-hour explanation of it from someone who's been there, reveals to you. And so I guess the entire point of this conversation is that we're going to be talking about a lot of theoretical abstract stuff here at times. But ultimately, the point is that we're talking about this stuff so that you can go to the places that we're trying to point you towards. So just open your mind to the possibility that there is a place you can go to where you can actually have all these insights and direct consciousness. Like, you can have direct consciousness of absolute truth. You can experience states of omniscience in which you become conscious of the entire functioning of the universe and how it works and why it exists and where it came from. And that's not just speculation. It's not just philosophy. You can actually do that, but you have to work at it. Like, getting to Antarctica is not easy. You see, like, it can be expensive. It can be perilous to your health. It can be dangerous. It can be cold, uncomfortable, and so all that comes with this work. So a lot of people, they want to talk about this work, but they don't want to do the work.
So I don't know if now is the time, but this does raise the question of Antarctica. If I have this one thing that I've experienced, and I know that psychedelics have paved the way for you to have these direct experiences, and I can say in the moment of the psychedelics, I am a believer. Like, I'm 100%. I often, when I'm in the experience, I'm like, you fucking moron. Like, how could you have been so foolish to ask some silly, asinine question about the truth of this? But then as I get farther and farther away from it, I go, well, wait a second. Like, that is as real to me as the breakfast that I ate 4 hours ago, or my memory of something that happened in my childhood. It is, I no longer have direct access to that. So how do you remain certain in your normal life of the absolute truth that you it feels like you encounter in those situations, in the same way that, like, I'll have a dream and I'll be absolutely certain that it's true,
right,
and then have a different experience which makes me question that. So
right.
That's something that I felt like I've experienced, the oneness and all of these sorts of things, but then as I get away from it, I go, are you sure that was...
Yeah, that's probably one of the biggest objections that many scientific materialists raise when you start talking about psychedelics. And by the way, it's important to say that I haven't just encountered these things on psychedelics. You can do it totally sober. So the biggest, and I've had sober experiences through meditation and so forth. So the biggest objection that scientific materialists have about psychedelics is to say, oh, it's just a hallucination. Everything is just, it's just neurons in the brain, doing stuff, chemicals. I mean, isn't it obvious that if you're taking a chemical, putting neurotransmitters into your mind, that's going to, get you to believe all sorts of crazy, wacky things. And, we know people have religious experiences and mystical experiences, and people even, have psychotic experiences. So what does this really tell us about absolute truth? I mean, everybody thinks that they have absolute truth when they're in fact deluded. Well, but you have to apply that same logic and doubt to your own scientific materialistic position. See, here's the fundamental problem, is that the mind loves to doubt everything except its own self. So it's not that I just went out there and did a bunch of psychedelics and then started to believe my own bullshit, which, some people tend to think. What happened was that even long before I even started doing psychedelics, I was deeply questioning the nature of reality and epistemology and how I know anything. I questioned religion, science, mysticism, philosophy, every philosophical school, everything. So basically what I did was I deconstructed my own mind and reality itself until nothing remained, until there was no more attachments, assumptions, or anything. And then when you do the psychedelics, that takes you to even a higher level. And so what you realize is that yes, psychedelics are hallucinations, but what you are failing to take into account is that everything is a hallucination. So this moment right now is a hallucination. And also, we should note from the scientific perspective, this moment right now is mediated by and rendered by neurotransmitters. You cannot be having this experience without neurotransmitters in here. Now, some people say DMT is naturally produced by the brain. I don't even know if we have good evidence of that. Seems like there's some good evidence of that, but it's not even about DMT. You have serotonin, you have epinephrine, norepinephrine, you have a bunch of chemicals. You have a chemical soup in here constantly churning away. Mm-hmm. And it is rendering your view of regular life, everything you think about yourself, your family, the world, the universe, and even the scientific method that you're using to study this thing and to do the chemistry on it, that itself is mediated, as science says, obviously, by the neurotransmitters in here, mm-hmm. right? So, I mean, it's almost laughably obvious, and yet almost no scientist realizes this or admits it, is that if you say that putting neurotransmitters in here, and psychedelics are just neurotransmitters.
Yep. Or yeah.
Thinking of them as drugs is really a problem. They're neurotransmitters. Different kinds. You put them in here, it changes how your consciousness functions. But you can't just assume that the way your consciousness functions sort of normally by default, that this is the true way, that this reveals that this is the best, truest version of reality we have, or that the skepticism that is arising right now, so right now you're skeptical, you're having doubts about whether any of this is true or whether what I'm saying is true, that doubt itself, you have to recognize, is only a function of what's going on in here. So if we change this, the idea of how you do science completely flies out the window, mm-hmm. right? So you can't just assume that there is some sort of simplified, objective scientific method and that we're using this to understand stuff, and then you take a psychedelic and it sends you some sort of hallucination. No. I mean, it's always been a hallucination. That's what reality is. It's a hallucination. And now we should focus on this term hallucination, because people don't have a good grasp of this term. I actually use this term. I love this term. I don't shy away from it. I embrace it because it has a very technical meaning. In psychology, hallucination means perception without any input or data. So traditionally, if you go to a mental hospital and you're telling them that you're seeing, monkeys running around with stripes and polka dots, they'll say you're hallucinating, because they'll say, well, you might be perceiving that in your consciousness, but it's not out here in the objective world. Right? So something's going on where you're experiencing something, but the experience isn't corresponding to there's nothing underneath the experience, the way we would say, normal experience, like if you see a tree, we agree that tree is over there. All of us agrees, like there's green plants behind me. All of us agree. And so we say, we're not hallucinating because there's actually plants behind me. But if you look closely, of these plants, you've got nothing but your perception of them. There's nothing ever behind your perceptions. That's an assumption. That's one of the key assumptions of the scientific materialistic paradigm, is that there's something sourcing perception. And so I like to...
One sec. I have a question about this. So it seems like I want to give the devil its due here, if you will, in that I suppose maybe this might be different for a schizophrenic person, but if I were to walk into a tree, I would perceive pain, when I smash my head into it. And so it seems that one of the things that really makes us trust the sober hallucination, if you will, is the perception of pain and pleasure, which lends seriousness to treating things as if they are real, even though we're not necessarily accessing the behind the phenomena.
Yeah. And I mean, pain and fear, suffering, these are the greatest illusions because you don't question them. You see, usually when we're just sitting comfortably here on this couch or in that room, we're both comfortable and our survival is not threatened. So this takes us into the issue of survival. See, all living beings are in an existential bind for survival. We have to be surviving all the time. If we're not surviving and we're not successful at it, then we're dead and we're not here and we can't be talking or thinking about survival or deeper philosophical issues and asking these questions. So everything assumes that you're surviving relatively well. If you can't handle that, nothing else is possible. So this puts us into an existential bind. So, we can sit here and be rational about things and be philosophers, but then, if I take a knife and stick it into your gut, all philosophy, all science goes out the window. Nothing matters. And look, notice this: all of your logic and reason goes out the window too. Mm-hmm. There's no logic or reason when I stab you with a knife in the gut. At that point, you're going to be reacting like an animal. You're going to be yelling, screaming. You're going to be attacking me. You're going to be fighting me, biting me. You're going to be, holding your. All of this is going to happen instinctually. There's not going to be any logic or reason behind it. You're just going to be acting out to save your ass, and that's because you had to, because that's how you got to where you are today. And so did I, and so did everybody.
And so this is one of the things that I want to give, the sober hallucination credit for, is that it does seem to be non-negotiable in those situations. And perhaps it is. Perhaps the most sophisticated of Buddhist monks could get stabbed in the gut. But that's something that I try to remain aware of, which is, we can talk and chat about what's real as much as we want. But when suffering is experienced,
right,
it rips you right out of these philosophical conversations into... That knife is real. Is that knife outside of me or inside of me?
We have to be careful. Is that real? Why? So
or it grabs me as real, I should say.
It grabs you, but I mean, really question this. It's not very difficult to question this. Why on earth would suffering and pain have anything to do with something being real? What's the connection?
Well, the connection, and again, I'll play. I do agree.
Yeah, I love it. Go for it.
I'll play the devil's advocate here.
Do it.
Is that, and this is the issue of survival. If I treat it as unreal, I cease to be, right? If I treat this knife wound, If I treat this knife wound as unreal, I bleed out and the pain isn't real and I cease to be. And so the things that have persisted.
Who cares?
Exactly.
I mean, Does science care? I mean, if you want to be really scientific, let's be scientific. I mean, I'm all about being scientific. I consider everything I talk about and I do as science. It's just a higher level of science. You have to be really objective with your science. The problem here is objectivity, neutrality, and lack of bias. So when people make an argument against what I say by saying that, oh, well, Leo, but if I stabbed you with a knife, you would be in pain and you would be, a hypocrite and all of this sorts of stuff. Look, yeah, if you stabbed me with a knife, I would be in pain, but that has nothing to do with the truth of the matter. Mm-hmm. Like, scientifically speaking, if I stab Albert Einstein while he's giving his lecture, does that change the truth of general relativity? No, it has nothing to do with it. Albert Einstein is a fragile, or was a fragile, creature. He could easily be killed and made uncomfortable and all this. And whenever you're doing your science, when you're doing science, you also have to do it in very comfortable conditions. Like, to do science, you can't be doing good science in a war zone or something like that. You got to have a lab where things are peaceful and stable, and then you could do your science. Otherwise, you can't. And universities sort of create that sort of cloistered environment wherein science and academia could be done. because otherwise survival is going to be war. People are going to be fighting each other, murdering each other, and there's no science, there's no logic, there's no reason. You can't be reasonable when your life is in danger.
Well, I actually, with that small point, I would say that there is science done on a battlefield. What is the best way to kill someone is tested, and when do I have to put the ammo in? How much ammo can I shoot before I need to reload? These sorts of things are tested, and so I want to expand science beyond the things that are simply done in laboratories, which is
yeah.
But yeah, so it sounds like what I'm hearing.
The science of killing is probably the oldest science.
Sure. Yeah. And it really calls what truth is to most people and is to me, and I'm not really sure if it ought to be otherwise, is the measure of truth is effectiveness. Does it, and I'm not saying it ought to be effectiveness, but the way that we treat it.
That is the original corruption. That is the original corruption of the human mind, is that, you see, when we think about it, most people, they don't care about truth. Most people care about survival.
What works. Yeah. So they don't care about what is, they care about what works.
And when I talk about survival, I don't just mean physically living. Survival for me is a much broader notion, which also includes thriving, it includes success, it includes reproduction, it includes love, it includes getting approval from your friends, it includes, going golfing with your golf buddies. That's all survival. That's how you survive. Humans invent more sophisticated ways of survival. Some of them are extremely ridiculous and elaborate, like, wearing gold chains and diamond pinky rings and all this sorts of nonsense. This is survival for, kids in the hood or whatever it is. Or, having a golden toilet. For some people, this is their version of survival, even though it's completely unnecessary. But, who's to say what's necessary in life? This is all subjective stuff. What kind of food you eat, even that, people have different ideas of what kind of food they need or want, and a lot of the food that people eat is garbage, poison, and they still love it. For them, it's survival. So it's very much
what is the problem with treating? Why is it corrupting? You said that's the original corruption, is that the measure of truth is effectiveness. That, I think, goes unspoken and completely assumed by the way that we behave, right? Like, how do you know that and people will say, like, well, the social sciences never put man on the moon, and it's, the measure of the truth of the physics was that it was effective. It did what we wanted it to do. Right. What else is there other than effectiveness? Right.
So this gets us into this is what you're talking about here, is sort of the pragmatic conception of truth. And a lot of people these days, along with scientific materialism, comes sort of all this stuff is very sneaky and implicit. You don't really know you're carrying this around with you, but you are a pragmatic conception of life. It's sort of this pragmatic philosophy that, well, we can do all this philosophy and fancy talking and academic stuff, but in the end, what really matters is how I feel about my life. Do I have the kind of girlfriend I want? Do I have the money I want? All this sorts of stuff. And even within this penetrates into the scientific domain in the sense that, look, when you fundamentally think of reality as a material, objective object, a collection of objects that are kind of just bouncing around in a mechanistic way, and that's all that reality is, it's just mechanics, pure mechanics. And you boil everything down to just physics. It's just atoms bouncing around in a giant three-dimensional container that is the universe. When you boil it down to that, then yeah, what else is there to life but just the mechanics of life and just, survival of the fittest and reproduction? That's like all there is, and then how you feel about it. And then within science, yeah, we see, to get humans to actually agree on worldviews and on their thinking about reality, it's very effective to have some sort of external objective standard, some sort of measure, like a ruler or a yardstick that we can use and all agree upon, because that helps us to build a consensus and all kind of be thinking along the same lines. And this is necessary to build a society with millions of people and to have a university and so forth. And science is very much a collective activity. It involves consensus building. So within hard sciences, we tend to cite examples like landing a man on the moon. Yeah, that's effective, but also look at it like this. Look, we can turn this around on the scientist, because the atheist would say, well, if I was a Christian, I came to you and I said, well, God exists, and you should believe in God and you should believe in my Christian dogma. As an atheist or a rationalist or a materialist, you would say, well, maybe I'll even grant you that God makes you happy because, you have this belief in the afterlife and this makes you happy in some way. And this may be even good for you because you act nicer. You're more moral because you're afraid that you're going to go to hell. So that, that gives you a little incentive to not be an asshole to your family and so forth and not to commit crimes. And so, yeah, maybe that's even good. I'll grant you that's even good for society. Maybe it's even good to have this sort of illusion, but it's just an illusion. It's a wishful thinking. It's not true, right? That's how atheists would argue against religious dogma. But notice that when the atheist argues this way, the atheist is arguing for actually some notion of truth which is deeper than just utility.
Are they? So what I perceive is that they're arguing from just a different level of survival effectiveness, which is to say that in their life, that what effectively gets them they don't need the man in the sky type God, and so what works for them to survive is intellectual posturing or these other sorts of things that get them. And so I wonder if they really are arguing for a truth that goes beyond effectiveness, or just for a different rubric for effectiveness in their own life.
They may not know that they are, but I would submit to you that any serious intellectual or scientist or rationalist, if you really sit down with him for hours and you corner him, you got to really corner him because he's going to be slippery. His mind's going to be very slippery. So if you take a pragmatist and you really corner him, eventually you'll corner him into such a position where he will be forced to admit that there is something that he values that we might call essential truth that is not simply utility. Because the problem with a utilitarian or pragmatic notion of truth is that it's so easily corrupted and it leads to so many falsehoods. So let me give you some examples here. Let's say you want to be a pure pragmatist and you believe that, like, what is scientifically true, objectively true, is just that which is effective. Well, there's a lot of effective stuff that you can do which we know is not going to be true in the long run. Mm-hmm. Like, for example,
so one of the example
you can
the
land
gun.
Like, you can land a man on the moon probably using Newtonian mechanics.
Sure.
You probably don't, I don't know if this is technically true, you probably don't need Einstein's general relativity to land a man on the moon.
A great example that is even more simpler is of the loaded gun. Brett Weinstein brings this up, which is the idea that you treat all guns as if they're loaded. And that's a very effective way to behave around guns. But we all have this intuition that, like, but that's not true. Like, some of these guns don't have bullets in them. So if whether or not you need general relativity to get to the moon, I don't know either.
Well, look, here's the crux of it, is that lies can be extremely effective.
Sure.
And falsehood can be extremely effective, and deception can be extremely effective. And in fact, the majority of what we're doing in the world is our mind is constructing fictions, illusions, ideologies, dogmas, false beliefs, which are extremely effective for short-term survival, but then later we realize they're not true. Mm-hmm. So
is it the case that
you can't just operate in life based on what is effective, because that will lead you down the road of what I call devilry.
Mm-hmm. So I think one of the things that is probably devilry in me is that maybe there's a kernel of it, but my interest in the truth, which I would say runs deeper than most people's, comes from a recognition that while lies are effective in the short term, that maybe there's something in it for me if I pursue this truth and take the short-term hit. But I haven't totally let go of the idea that truth might be bliss. Truth might be, might be an end to suffering. Like, I still want the carrot, if that makes sense. And quite frankly, I don't know how I wouldn't.
Right. And yeah, that's also survival. So the problem is that the ego mind, it can't help itself. It's selfish. This is the fundamental problem. Everything that we're talking about here, all these problems ultimately boil down to just selfishness. It's just selfishness. You're being selfish. And that's not a judgment on you. I'm not judging you and saying that I'm above you because I'm selfless. No, we're all in an existential bind. We're all selfish to various degrees. And your selfishness has consequences. And even all the problems of science, they all boil down to selfishness. And your example with the, getting stabbed with the pain and not being able to, and conflating pain and suffering with truth and reality as evidence for truth and reality, this is also just selfishness. You're only doing that because you're selfish and you're looking out for your own life and your own survival, and you had to do that to get to where you are today. But notice something, that that selfishness itself might be untrue.
And so this is I think one of the. I guess you can get there with meditation. The only thing that even makes this possibly understandable by me is the fact that I've done psychedelics, and I have had those experiences of the dissolution of the self, which for me was horrifying. I hated it. I gripped it as tight as I could as it slipped through my fingers, and it was the most challenging experience of my entire life, bar none. But yeah, to experience awareness, mostly independent of a self, is, I think, one of the promises of psychedelics, and is why I can follow this conversation as opposed to just mere conjecture of like, oh, I have had a glimpse of that in my own life, and I presume that, you know, with your extensive psychedelic experience.
What is the self, and why is it important? Like, you have to ask yourself, and this is where you start to see the breakdown between truth and utility and survival, is that if you look at it from a very objective point of view, look at it from the point of view not of an individual creature or a human, but from the universe itself. Like, do you believe the universe itself has a self?
Do I believe? I don't have a belief regarding that. I don't think.
Science would say no. Like, if you ask a scientist, does the universe have a self? Like, why would the universe have a self? Does a rock have a self?
I mean, what I would say, I'm uncertain. Is where I'm at, but I understand what you're saying, is that many people and most scientists would presume that selves are, you know, monkeys, humans, maybe some dogs, but that's about as far as we go.
And what about what about life itself? Why are we assuming that life is more important than not life? Why is survival important at all? Why does it matter?
Sure, and I think the answer that people would give is that it's an axiom, and it comes down to fundamental experiences of pleasure and pain and things that we selfishly.
But I mean, this is not rocket science. Like right now, you who are listening right now, just realize that there's absolutely no reason. There's no logical scientific reason for why you should live versus not. There just isn't. Like, just recognize this.
Sure.
Right?
Sure.
There's no reason. So from a truth standpoint, there absolutely is no reason, for example, why you should survive and some child in Africa should die. Like, there's no reason why my life is more important than your life. Mm-hmm. There's no reason why a mouse's life is less important than a human's life. All of these things, can you just see that it's just pure selfishness? The reason I think my life is important, the reason I want to feel good, the reason I want money, the reason I want sex, the reason I want pleasure, the reason I want to live for 80 years and not experience any disease is simply because I'm me and I don't want to suffer. But I mean, this is purely selfish.
Sure. So, and I guess this is the thing. Do we not endorse in this very active conversation that the self is not an illusion? And again, I tend to be open to your, but I want to tee you up to answer this. I'm sitting here feeling as me. You're sitting there feeling as you, with the experiences of pleasure and pain. Does our very conversation not endorse the idea of selfhood, at the very least, existing in you and I as separate entities?
No, of course not. Why would it?
Does your experience? So my experience right now in this moment is of separateness. Like, I am not you. I am not seeing what you are seeing. I'm confined to my own sensory experience. So if I go to my direct experience right now, I do feel atomized in the universe.
Right. Yeah.
And I imagine that many people out there feel that too.
Yeah, that's the ego self. Right. And
so here's the question.
A lot of my time I do spend in that disconnection, but like also I can focus in. Like right now I can take my consciousness, as you were talking there. Mm-hmm. I took my consciousness and I just became, like, right now I'm literally conscious that I'm you.
Mm-hmm. And so when you say you're conscious, spell that out for me, because I presume, like, you would not know that I scratched my leg, or what felt like my leg right there. So what does that mean, to be conscious that you are me, and what is that experience?
Well, this is where it gets very radical. I can put it in. I can say it from my point of view, or I can say it from your point of view. And really, it would probably be better to say it from your point of view. You are the only thing that exists.
Mm-hmm. From my perspective.
So you're imagining me.
Yes.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm imagining you, but you're imagining me imagining you, and I'm imagining you imagining me, and it goes like it's like a two-way sort of two mirrors facing each other into infinity. Mm-hmm. Like a mirrored hallway. So you are imagining that I have a conscious experience separate from your own. You're imagining that.
Yes.
And
So,
by imagining it, you are hallucinating it into existence. You're creating it. So here's the whole trick of how this works, is that you are constructing all of reality, but you're not conscious of how you're doing it.
mm-hmm.
And the ego mind is not in control of how it's being done. So when I say you are imagining reality, people say, well, Leo, if you're imagining reality, then just imagine hair growing on top of your head. Why can't you do that? Then, you're full of shit. And the answer is that the Leo ego, the human ego that you think is Leo, has no control over what is being imagined.
Mm-hmm.
So the ego can't control this.
So I'm repeating back so I understand that there is a me that is not confined to my skin bag, and that is imagining this experience of me separate from you having a conversation.
All right, so let me just, because there's a lot of different, it can get very murky and confused. Let me just lay this out in the sort of,
Sure.
I'll lay out sort of my vision of how the universe works, because it's actually very simple to state it. Basically what I'm saying is that the entire universe is a field of consciousness. There is nothing outside of this field of consciousness. You are this entire field of consciousness. This field of consciousness is the only thing that exists. Nothing outside of it could possibly exist. And everything you see, including this room and your physical body and everything, science, everything, it's all being imagined by this universal field of consciousness or a universal mind. And that's basically it. It's the mind, the infinite mind. And so it's constantly imagining things. And the trick, though, is that what you see is the very imagination process. Usually when we say imagination, people think like, oh, it's like daydreaming. There's multiple layers to imagination. The human mind generally has access to, daydreams, nighttime dreams. We consider those imagination, fantasies or thoughts. And then we kind of stop there and we say, well, that's all the imaginary realm. And then there's the real realm here, like the couch I'm sitting on, the trees behind there, the hands. But this is also imagination. Physical stuff is also imagination, which is what you realize on psychedelics, because all the physical stuff becomes very melty. It starts to melt, right? You've experienced this. As it's melting, you're realizing that this too is just mind. Your physical body is also mind, just a different, deeper gradation of imagination. It's a much more powerful imagination. Like, imagine if you had such a powerful imagination that you could imagine an apple, and you imagine it so strongly that it would physically materialize right in front of you. That's literally what is happening, but your ego mind cannot do that using its normal human capacities. Mm-hmm. But it is happening. Like, the floor you're sitting on is literally that.
Got it. So I want to pause. Justin, are you, because I've watched a lot of Leo's stuff and I've seen him talk about this. How are you tracking right now? Is this making sense? Do you have questions? What's going on in your head? And if any doubts or anything? Oh, throw on your microphone.
Not so much doubts. I'm just trying to keep up. I got lost halfway through the conversation, and then I came back at the end.
You popped in.
Yeah, when you went back to everything is not real. That kind of makes sense to me, that concept.
Okay.
Though it's not something that I've ever considered. It just sounds like something that people who have comparatively done a lot of psychedelics would
tend to say, yeah.
So I just, yeah.
Got it. Okay,
well,
yeah, so where I sit...
Not just psychedelics, but mystics have been saying this for a long time. The wisest men throughout history and women have been saying this for a long time. Mm-hmm. I mean, you were reading Ramana Maharshi, I heard in one of your recent podcasts, right?
Yep.
One of the
quotes... I find that compelling.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, one of the quotes I love from him is, he has a quote where he says, there can be no doubt I'm paraphrasing. There can be no doubt whatsoever that the entire universe is nothing but a mere illusion.
Mm. So. Yeah, and where I personally sit, and I'm on board with the skepticism of the material world, and I've had that. And I've had these glimpses into what you might call an absolute truth. Yet I remain open to it. Like right now, I'm in just a period of epistemological and metaphysical, like maybe is where I am with regard to all of this, and I'm intrigued and interested in almost all of it. Would you say that the answer? I mean, not the answer. Is it more mystical experiences, more meditation?
Actually, even not so. I mean, of course, those are all helpful, but even more important, what you need to do is you need to deconstruct your whole reality. Mm-hmm. Right. So the problem is that your mind is in an active, constant process of constructing reality, all of reality. And your mind has very clever defense mechanisms to prevent you from deconstructing the entire thing, because if you do, your survival will be completely crippled.
Yes.
Right. And so you should be able to, if you self-reflect, you should be able to notice how your mind is fooling you and defending against various things in order to keep you comfortable in your little, survival paradigm. And so really what you have to do is you have to sit down and question everything. I mean, absolutely everything. So people sometimes think that, well, Leo's not very skeptical about some of these things. He's just engaging in wishful thinking and he's just buying into beliefs and stuff. No. Don't misunderstand. I'm the most skeptical person in the world. I was so skeptical that it literally killed me. Mm-hmm. Right? Like, you're so skeptical that you sit down and you question everything, including your skepticism, including how you're applying your skepticism, including all of the biased ways in your application of skepticism. So, for example, when you have that psychedelic experience and then you come back later and you're like, well, maybe it wasn't true, even that you have to question and be doubtful about. Because when you start to question that, you'll realize that, wait a minute, my own doubting is itself the illusion. It's just more illusion layered on top of illusion. So you have to keep, it's very tricky because your mind is going to resist this in a million different ways. It's very intelligent. Your mind is so intelligent about how it's constructing reality. It has to, because otherwise you would literally lose your mind. People end up in mental hospitals over this because they start questioning reality a little bit and then they go off the deep end somewhere. They start experiencing, once your mind really opens up, you can have just spontaneous, just sober, non-psychedelic, mystical experiences, and that stuff can freak you out, especially if you haven't read any books about it, you haven't watched any videos about it, you have no context for it. People can start to feel like they're losing their mind, like they're going crazy. In fact, that's what a lot of people in mental hospitals are. And the people who are treating them, the materialist doctors, don't understand this. So they're treating them as though these people have serious mental disorders. A lot of times they don't have serious mental disorders. They're just literally their reality is being deconstructed through some sort of natural process spontaneously. And they don't know how to cope with it. And these doctors are just medicating them or, just giving them the standard materialistic explanations for things. And that doesn't help them.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like, it does sound like, if this person who is having a schizophrenic but potentially non-dual experience, which is truer than anything that's going on in that hospital, is given certain drugs, that it will affect them. So it does seem that we are pulled between two levels of reality. One is this survival, human, 2 eyes, 10 fingers life, and another is something more. Is that... And it doesn't seem that there's an option, perhaps until death, to let go of the human survival part, or I guess that would quickly result in one's death.
Yeah, if you want to keep surviving, you got to keep surviving. Mm-hmm. Even if you're enlightened, you still have to participate in survival if you care about surviving. And some people don't. And many mystics and so forth, they've just died.
Yeah.
That's the thing, is that when you really have no self anymore, if you truly transcend the self fully, you literally don't care if you physically die.
This is something that has concerned me for a while because, I understand people talk about non-attachment, and it's perhaps a perfect ideal, but the perfect teacher dies very quickly. They don't make it very long. So
right.
What we're left with are, it seems like, imperfect teachers who still have an attachment of some sort, right. Whether it's a preference for life or they just like food or whatever, they haven't gone the whole way. And so it's not very memeable, this let yourself go and die, because it just snuffs itself out as soon as it's discovered.
Exactly.
Every time.
Yeah, it's perfectly tautological. So in other words, This is much more profound than even you realize yet. But the only reason you are alive here in this form is because you're afraid of going into a different form. So the only thing that keeps you literally here on this planet is your fear. Mm-hmm. If you didn't have fear, you wouldn't be here anymore, and you wouldn't be going through all the suffering. So you're literally creating this dream. You're in a dream. You've constructed this dream because you're afraid to go to a higher dream.
Sure.
And so that fear is the linchpin that holds absolutely everything together. Your fear of death. And so of course you're gonna everything in your psyche, everything you've been taught, all of your instincts, all of your desires, all of that is going to turn you against completely deconstructing your sense of self and reality, because if you did so, you would cease to be here. So it all perfectly matches together.
So for you personally, do you see yourself one day starving to death? I mean, what is your, and I mean this not flippantly, like is it, Goals, I suppose, are counter to what we're even speaking of, because the idea of a goal presumes a preferred outcome. What is, as you ascend or become more enlightened, does that necessarily, if successful, result in your complete lack of attachment and then subsequent death?
Yeah, in practice, it's a lot trickier. I still have many attachments and fears which keep me here, and honestly, it's a struggle. I don't know where I'm going to end up. Mm-hmm. I mean, honestly, if I like went balls to the wall with it, all the way, then what would happen is that just the entire material universe would just cease to exist. And the entire world and everybody with it, including myself, would just cease to exist. And I would just rest as an infinite singularity forever. That would be the ultimate state. You basically so what happens is that you become more and more conscious. You become more and more conscious of your attachments and why you're attached to this thing, why you need sex, why you need food, why you need money, all this sorts of stuff. And then you become more and more conscious, and then slowly you lose interest in these material things because you've experienced them enough to the point where it's like, yeah, okay, I know how it works. It's cool and everything, but like, I want something deeper. Is there anything deeper I can get? And then you realize, oh, there's a little bit deeper. I need to go a little bit deeper and a little bit deeper and a little bit deeper. And what you realize that is, at some point you realize that what you're really after is you're after consciousness. You're not after anything else. The money, the sex, the business, all the success, and all this sorts of stuff, these were all substitutions for inferior substitutions, limited substitutions for what you really want, which is pure, absolute, unadulterated consciousness and love. And so you start to move towards that, and you relinquish more and more of yourself. But as you're doing that, it burns your ego, it burns your sense of self away, and it feels very painful, and you don't know how deep you want to go. Most of us have sort of a limit to how far we're willing to go.
Does free will figure into this? I saw an early video of yours that was a determinist worldview that I think I understand pretty well and subscribe to. You know, one of my common experiences on psychedelics is just like, this is, I don't want to say happening to you is doesn't do it justice, because that implies a separateness. But in my day-to-day life, the ego likes to think that I can make choices and do things better or worse. And then when I get into these, it's like, this is the ride. you are strapped in. So stop beating yourself up for not being where you couldn't possibly be. So did you come back around to free will at any point?
Yeah. It's my views on free will have evolved quite a bit, because that video you referenced is like 5 years old or 6 years old. And since then I've had some huge epiphanies about how will works. So it's very twisted and fascinating. So basically, it's sort of relativistic. If you're in the human state of consciousness that you and I are sort of in right now, sort of ordinary, conventional, dual consciousness, like separate selves, then you could say we do have free will, because our notion of free will is sort of a relativistic thing. Like, what we really mean by free will is that, like, yeah, I could choose to go to the gym today or not go to the gym, eat that donut or not eat that donut. And in a certain pragmatic sense, we have that option. We have that choice. But when you become really, really conscious, what you realize is that the entire universe, everything that's happening here, is absolute truth. Absolute truth is absolutely true under all circumstances. It can't be anything other than what it is. It's a perfect tautology. And therefore, this is sort of the twisted paradox of it, is that when you reach God consciousness, you realize that God is love, and it cannot be anything other than love, and therefore everything that's occurring and has ever occurred has always been absolute love, and that it's happening for the purpose of love, and that it cannot literally be anything else, and that God himself, even though we could say God has infinite will by willing all of this into existence, God itself doesn't really have free will, in the sense that all of God's will is going 100% into the generation of absolute love. Therefore, God cannot be anything other than absolute love, and it couldn't be anything less than that. Therefore, even God itself doesn't really have free will, because it gave all of its free will towards infinite love.
So this is a good place to come back to the question that I'd flagged earlier. I remain open to all of that, but how do you know that right now? So what is as something other than a belief or a memory? Because that's what I remain, I suppose, skeptical or curious about. Is even when I look in my own index of psychedelic experiences, they do exist as memories. Now, certainly some of it has been integrated and has become the part and parcel of how I experience life. But so for that, is that something that you feel like you're experiencing, or is that or are those words that you are repeating?
Well, it's a little trickier than that. Well, first of all, I would ask you, how do you know anything? people love to question, Leo, how do you know this? How do you know that? Well, how do you know anything? Like, really, when you start to deeply question, what you realize is that you don't really know anything. And anything you think you know, including when you're sitting there doubting stuff, that's not something you know. That's just something you believe.
Sure. My answer to that would be, I'm using language in a manipulative, often espousing beliefs without tapping into the true experience. I do have, when I tap into it, a direct experience of something, but right. As I tap into it, I am unaware of God or love or the absolute truth. When I hit that, my pay dirt is not that yet. Or maybe,
here's what will help you, is that actually the answer to how do you know anything is actually very simple and clear, because there's only one way to know something. It's to be conscious of it. Mm-hmm. You only, how do you know you exist?
Yes, it would be, like Descartes said, I think, but I think a better formulation is I am, therefore I am. I am conscious.
Right now, you're conscious that you exist. Mm-hmm. So that's how you know. But see, if I wanted to sort of adopt your position, I could say, well, maybe you don't exist. Because, consciousness, what is this? Maybe it's just a belief or something.
Well, this is my question. No,
you're conscious of it.
Are you conscious of it? Well, this is my question. Are you conscious of God as love as we're speaking?
It's a little tricky to answer that, because there's a lot of different ways in which one could be conscious of it. So there could be much higher states of consciousness that I could be in, where I could just be literally enraptured in ecstasy, like squirming on the floor. Like I've literally experienced infinite love to such a degree that just like you would be plastered on the floor in like writhing in sexual ecstasy, like that much love. So obviously I'm not experiencing that right now.
Yeah.
But
makes for an easier conversation.
But yeah, you can't have a conversation. You can't even walk in you can hardly walk in that state. So the state I'm in now is much lower, but I've had enough of these states to the point where I can tune in right now and just realize that, yeah, this whole room is God. And see, love is a much more profound thing than an emotion. People misunderstand love. It sounds very sort of hippy dippy and new agey to say that everything is love, because people, again, part of the materialistic paradigm is that it assumes that love is a human emotion or feeling that living beings have, and only like the higher living beings. Like you probably don't think that an ant has much love, but like maybe a mammal has some love, but a human has more capacity to love. But this is just a little tip of the iceberg of what love really is. Love is actually a metaphysical thing. Love is a feature or the essence of consciousness itself. So if you get rid of the idea that there is anything beyond consciousness, and I mean, just notice this, you've never experienced anything beyond consciousness. So you have no scientific reason to believe there's anything beyond consciousness, because consciousness is all you've ever experienced. True?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, I agree.
I mean, even in theory, there's no way that you could experience something outside of consciousness, because if you were to experience it, it would be conscious for you, and therefore it's inside of consciousness. So when you realize this very deeply, you realize consciousness is infinite, therefore there cannot be anything outside of consciousness. Sometimes people say, oh, Leo, but what if you're wrong, and what if there actually is something beyond consciousness? How would you know? Well, when you experience infinite consciousness, the key realization there is that it's infinite. Infinite means there's nothing that could be outside of it, because infinite has no outside, because it goes on forever, literally. Mm-hmm. So if there's nothing outside of consciousness, this is all there is, and you have direct access to it. There's not a veil of perception. So this is another assumption of the materialistic paradigm of science, is that, well, there's an objective world out there, and then there's the world of sensations or perceptions in here, and what I'm seeing is just a veil. It's not the real thing. The real thing is behind the scenes. We can't access that. Well, that's true in that paradigm, but consider that there are no objective things behind the scenes. There is no veil then. There's only perception. Perception is reality. Appearance is reality. Appearance is absolute truth.
Mm-hmm. So I suppose a question here. Is it...
Hold on. Very important.
Sure.
And how do I know that?
Sure.
Because the same way you know that you're alive, you're conscious. You're conscious of it. So here's the thing, is that people are trying to get to some sort of knowledge or truth through an objective, non-conscious material method. And that itself is the delusion, because that is happening within consciousness. So what you have to bite the bullet of consciousness and to realize that your consciousness is not just some secondary thing that could be wrong. Your consciousness is the only thing that there is, and it's absolutely true. So if you're doubting your own consciousness, you're completely fucked. There's no way you can make any progress towards truth if you doubt your own consciousness, because you can't even then say that you exist. You can't even do science, because science assumes that your consciousness of science is valid and true. Because science is done by consciousness.
Sure. I guess my question here is well, with that last piece, I go, does that not fall into the same trap of truth as effective? You know, like it won't work if we doubt consciousness? Like you can't even conduct science if you doubt consciousness? It seems to me that even the doubting is...
Actually, you can. In fact, that's how science is done today.
Sure. Well, I think I struggled to totally understand what you were saying in this last bit.
Yeah, well,
that's okay.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to explain further. So, what would you like to know?
I guess, well, I'll even take it a step backwards to where I feel on more solid ground in terms of understanding. One of the things that as I do my psychedelic experiences that I am encountering, and this is why I posed the question to you about language, is that there are things that I know and can state and repeat, and there are things that I am and that I exude and have integrated. And so part of the reason that I continue to go back is because I realize there's a lot that I quote-unquote know, but if I inspect it, it's memory, ideology, dogma, and it might not, so take love, for instance, like I know that I love, just very concretely, people in my life. Mm-hmm. But when I'm in these experiences, I go, oh, like, you're not being love. And that doesn't mean just saying I love you and hugs and kisses. It means tapping into that wellspring at a felt sensation in the here and now. And so that was why I was sort of asking, like, what do I know? Like, I can say, go ahead.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's of course true. That's good. There's an even deeper layer than that, which is that when you realize your love, even if you're not feeling anything, like... Mm-hmm. Like you could even be hating somebody, and you could still recognize that as love. Or you could just be sitting quietly, meditating, and not experiencing anything special or positive, and you would still be love. In fact, right now you are love.
Mm-hmm. So
but you're not conscious of it, and so see, there's no way to get underneath consciousness. There's no way to get around consciousness. There's no way to avoid consciousness. Either you're conscious of some of these things I'm saying, or you're simply not. And then the work is just to become conscious of it. And from your point of view, you might say, well, maybe it's bullshit and maybe I can't become conscious of it. Well, then that's where you are, and that's where you'll be until one day you become more conscious. See, so there's no way around consciousness.
So question here, and this is even stepping backwards, but how does morality fit into this sort of a scheme for you? Because this is something that I've been questioning. Is in a world where there are preferable things and non-preferable things, and you assume that consciousness is shared by people with your same shape, and even if they don't have your same skin color, and even if they're not the same gender, then you would start to expand the circle of who matters. And for a while to me it seemed like, oh, this is going to expand to everything. But then I go, wait a second, if everything is love, and I've heard you say, even the Holocaust is an expression of love, even the most horrifying things are expressions of universal love. Where does morality and right and wrong fit into, and I mean this, I guess, at an experiential level of myself as a person and not myself as God?
Yeah, well, that's the whole problem, is that when you take it as yourself as a person, it can't work. So you have to take yourself as God. That's the problem. So see, I'll answer the question from both sides, because I know you want, and the audience is interested in sort of the practical. But first, let me answer it from the sort of the very highest perspective. From the highest perspective, if you realize that everything is love, then that's it. You're done. There's no problems. There's no more questions about morality. You don't care about morality anymore. It literally doesn't matter, because literally you're conscious that anything that happens is absolute love, and nothing could be better. Everything is absolutely perfect. You're in paradise. You're in heaven. And so, great.
So we cut the Gordian knot. Your problem
right? Yeah.
solved.
I mean, like literally, it's such a radical shift in perspective that I mean, you're literally in ecstasy. Like, you start to experience orgasmic levels of ecstasy. Like, you think an orgasm, like, imagine the best orgasm you've ever had, and then multiply it by 1,000. That's what it's like to realize that everything is absolute love. Like, even the Holocaust, racism, murder, everything evil that was ever done to you by your parents and enemies and everybody who hates you, everything that has ever been done, that is all love. When you realize that, it's such a huge relief. But the cost of that is that you completely give up yourself. You can't have a self anymore at that level of consciousness, because literally there's no self to defend. Because your self is nothing other than a collection of defense mechanisms from the realization of everything being love. And see, at that point, you don't care. The question, like, well, but Leo, what happens tomorrow? What if I get run over by a car? What if somebody shoots me? Shouldn't I be worried about that? Like, no, you don't care. It doesn't matter. You've reached such a level of consciousness that you realize that caring about anything at all is completely idiotic. And I mean that across the board. I mean, you no longer care whether your mother dies or not. You no longer care about slavery existing or not. You no longer care about the Holocaust or terrorism, or like you realize this is the key. This is the most radical level of consciousness, is that you realize literally that absolutely every difference that you thought was real is completely imaginary, and is just a bias. You have a preference for one difference over another. Like you say, well, but Leo, there's a difference between slavery and non-slavery, right? Mm-hmm. Ordinarily, we would say, yeah, of course, there's a huge difference between those two. But in the state of consciousness, you realize that difference is imaginary. It has no reality or substance to it whatsoever, and it doesn't even matter which one of those is happening. And then you're in love. You literally fall head over heel in love with the entire universe. And then that's it. Life is, the whole ordeal of life is fixed in one fell swoop. But now, answering your practical question, when we come back down to human consciousness and we're living in society and we're talking about how to make a good social system that's fair and equal for people, then now you're in a lower level of consciousness. And so now what you can do is you can say, well, okay, what morality becomes then is sort of a poor reflection of that absolute, unconditional, universal love. So here we would say something like, well, to be moral and still function in the human world, you want to treat others basically as you would want to be treated yourself, as though they were yourself, as though you cared about their suffering. And you want to not be too selfish and not be too biased. And also, you want to be truthful. Because if you're just living pragmatically for your own survival or for the survival of your tribe or your clan or your country, or the whole problem here is bias, you see. What's happening is that humans are getting biased towards one thing or another thing within reality, and then we're defending that, and that is what's causing evil or harm to others. So, for example, if I work at Coca-Cola, the company, and I'm, a manager there, I care about the survival of Coca-Cola, and I hate Pepsi because they're my competitor, and I don't care about them, so I'm biased towards my company. And then I don't care about, other companies. I don't care about the environment maybe because I only care about the profits of my company. See, when you adopt this very biased, partial perspective, then you're going to be causing all sorts of collateral damage and evil in the world through deceptive advertising and, selling Coca-Cola to children and, rotting their teeth and making them fat in school and all sorts of social problems cascade from the fact simply that you're being very selfish and limited in your perspective and attitude towards your life. Mm-hmm. And you see this within politics, you see this in your personal life, in your family life, and so forth. So basically, the whole idea, if we want society to be more peaceful and to be more cohesive and to function more smoothly, there's only one solution, which is be less biased, be less deceptive, be more truthful, and be less selfish, and that's it. That's the whole solution. It's very simple. Mm-hmm. The only problem is how much of that can you tolerate?
Got it.
Because you can't tolerate too much of it. Because then you're going to be like, well, Leo, how do I survive? If I'm not going to be competing with Pepsi, then they're going to fire me from my Coca-Cola job because they want someone who's going to compete with Pepsi. They're going to fire me, and then I can't feed my children, and then my children are going to starve. And so, see, the person is in this existential bind of survival. All of us are. And so that's why we're selfish and biased and deceitful.
Got it. Yeah, and it seems like one of the ways that historically we've been able to move out of that game, and maybe this will take us around to spiral dynamics, is that technology, and I suppose like the increase in population, has enabled larger and larger segments of the population to live without such pressing survival needs, which enables you to go, you know what, I will get fired from my, job at Philip Morris selling cigarettes because I'm not going to die and my children won't starve. I'll take a pay cut and I can go work at a different company that, is maybe exploiting people in some way, but it's not quite as obvious as, selling cigarettes and jewels to kids. So it seems like there's, technology is moving us forward, and maybe this is where we can touch on spiral dynamics. I'll give just a brief overview, and you can add anything you like. Spiral dynamics is, from my understanding, it was made by this guy, Claire Graves, and it was his based on studies of a lot of different people and what they understood about their developmental psychology at different periods in their life. And it also tracked sort of almost with an upper limit that few people exceeded in any given time period with where a society was at a certain stage. So you might say that earlier stages were very tribalistic and warlike, then you enter into this medieval, listen to the church dogmatism, you evolve into this capitalist individualism, into what you might call more socialist, care about everyone in the environment, and then beyond into things that I really can't describe because they don't exist in governments. They exist mostly in people, which is stage yellow and stage turquoise. And all of these stages are color-coded. So that's spiral dynamics. Is there anything you want to add to that before we sort of talk about it?
Yeah, it was based on the works of Claire Graves, but also popularized by Don Beck and Christopher Cohen, so they deserve some credit for that. They're academics who actually wrote the spiral dynamics book and trademarked that name. But yeah, it's based on the works of Claire Graves. But yeah, that's a good summary. Basically, what I would add to that is that it turns out that when you start to study the value systems of humans across the world, which Claire Graves did in like the 60s, 1960s, he was sort of shocked to discover that there's a certain consistent progression and order to these different value systems. And there's not that many different value systems And this is not just something that's part of Western culture, really it applies around the entire world. And so he developed this developmental psychological model where you can actually track and see how one's cognitive development or moral development or spiritual development evolves over time and becomes more sophisticated and complex, and better able to deal with the complexities of our evolving society and culture. And so he mapped that out, and then the spiral dynamics guys, they color-coded it and called it spiral dynamics. And so we have these different stages. These stages are sort of, you might think of them as evolutions of the human psyche. The human psyche becomes more refined and nuanced in order to deal with more complexity. So like if we go back 2,000 years, you can imagine that most people, they weren't very educated. Their psyches were not very well developed in the sense that it was a much more brutal way of surviving. Like the sort of spiral dynamic stage red, as they call it, where we had dictators and tyrants, and we had slavery, and we had feudal warlords. And so basically, the way societies were structured 2,000 years ago, like I'm thinking of like the ancient Roman times, is that whoever had the largest army would just conquer and rape and pillage the neighboring town, and that was their way of surviving. And that was considered acceptable. There was not even, at that time, even the idea of a morality that said that that's wrong or bad, that didn't even really exist. It took that, people don't realize, that had to be evolved and developed over time. Culture had to refine itself to such a level where people realize, like, wait a minute, like, raiding and raping and pillaging a neighboring city, that's evil? Like, that didn't compute for most people for a long time. Mm-hmm. But then, we evolved beyond that, and we got into, like, the Middle Ages. And then we got into like the Renaissance era, and then we got into like Industrial Revolution and so forth. And as that kept happening, the mind became more sophisticated, it became more scientific, it became less dogmatic, less superstitious, less mystical, we might say. And that evolution is still continuing to this day. And this is happening collectively as a society. It's happening individually in different countries, but it's also happening in different organizations depending what company you're working at. Companies have different spiral stages, and it's happening individually within you. I mean, throughout your own life, you can sort of see how your own psyche evolved. You might have, like, when you were a teenager, for example, you might have been very rebellious in school. You might have, like, fought with authority figures and, done drugs and had difficulty disciplining yourself. But then you evolved beyond that. You outgrew that phase, and then you developed some discipline, and then you developed some work ethic, and you started caring about being a nice person, where before you were an asshole. You realized being an asshole doesn't work so well. It's not good for me, not good for them. So you evolve, and then you can continue that evolution.
Mm-hmm. Great. So, let's talk. I want to talk about, I have like an interested but frustrated relationship with spiral dynamics. I'm curious what you think. So things that I enjoy about it is that it says that you can't just go to Iraq and give them democracy. And I really enjoy that aspect of it, that there's not a place that everyone is supposed to be. And you can't just teleport different cultures, different individuals with different backgrounds to where you might think is the preferred place for them to be. That there are stages that people must go through in order to get to what might be some of the more peaceful, harmonious stages. But if you try to skip them too quickly, you just create more chaos. And so I like that aspect of it, because I think oftentimes we just view it almost on a spectrum. It's like, here we are. There's freedom on one side, there's tyranny on the other, and we just want to crank everybody right on over to freedom. And that is foolhardy, and just it gets people hurt and killed, even worse than before potentially. So I really like that aspect of it. Something that I've struggled with, though, is that even as I look at my own life, it sometimes feels hard for me to chart myself on this particular thing, because I feel like, when I was 20, I was like what you would appear to be green on the outside, like super into the, we got to help everybody, and multicultural, and I traveled abroad and learned a bunch of languages, and I had to mix and mingle. And now I find myself, perhaps it's after having done some business, sometimes it's more orange, more yellow, sometimes with an understanding of what you might call the value of some of the exploitive capitalist systems that exist out there, that I previously was just like, this is just mean people taking advantage of the downtrodden. And now I go, oh, this was like the best solution at the time. So I find myself yanked to either side of green in my own life, is what I would say. And so I'm curious if that resonates with you or what you think of that.
Yeah,
I find myself not really landing or going through green in a meaningful way, and just instead like yellow or orange, which for those people who don't know, orange is individualist, entrepreneurial, capitalist, but can be very selfish. Green is very multicultural, almost to a fault, where it's like there are no right answers, and like
yeah, it's
and
the
then yellow,
social justice warriors is
yes.
green. Yeah.
And then yellow is systematic, has an understanding of everything that comes before it, and starts to see the value of the previous stages, and recognizes that there's not just one simple solution, one size fits all. So I'm curious if you've experienced that in your own life, or anything like skipping stages or finding some of them hard to really sink into.
Oh yeah, I can help you to make sense of that. So, you see, first of all, it has to be said that the spiral dynamics model is very, very complicated. So like, to really understand how it fully works, it's such a complex model, it can take 20, 30, 50 hours of studying it to really understand it. So we're going through it really fast, and also because of this, it takes time to really get a good sense of it. So when you first start, you do have difficulty placing people in certain categories. You're not quite sure where they fit. And also, it should be said that spiral dynamics does not simplistically say that you're only in one category. It says that you fall into a range of different categories with different sort of, like, you can do a chart where you can say, like, well, you've got this much green and this much orange and this much yellow, a little bit of yellow, you know, whatever. You can do kind of like a bar chart for different people. So that explains part of the answer is that nobody is at any one color stage. We scatter along, and we have a certain center of gravity, and then there's sort of a bell curve distribution sort of away from that center of gravity. So if you're at like, high green, low yellow, let's say, then yeah, you're still going to have plenty of green. You're still going to have plenty of orange in there probably, and maybe a little smattering of turquoise when you're experiencing psychedelics, right? Mm-hmm. So it's like that. But also, see, it's very much a cultural phenomenon too, because what they say in the book is that really these stages are memes. They're meme complexes, and memes are just they're basically collections of ideas. So the reason that when you were in your early 20s, you were heavily into the green meme complex, which is the social justice warrior sort of philosophy, trying to create equality for people, democracy, egalitarianism, maybe socialism, maybe a bit of Marxism, this sort of stuff, all the stuff Jordan Peterson rails against, all of that stuff. You were into that because probably the culture, the place, I don't know where you grew up, but the
I was
area
in Washington, D.C. in college.
Right, exactly. So that explains it. So like you grew up in an area where that was the predominant culture. And your friends were probably in it, your family was probably somewhat in it, and so you got immersed into that, and you just picked up these memes. You didn't think about them very deeply, and you didn't derive them from first principles or from direct experience. You mostly just kind of gleaned it from your professors, from your friends, from the media you watched, and so forth. And so you got all that, and I got a lot of that too, because I grew up like in Southern California. Environmentalism and all recycling, you just pick this stuff up. Like if you're living in Southern California, everyone's recycling and talking about recycling. So it's like that's what you're supposed to do. And then when you move to like Alabama or someplace and nobody's recycling there and they look at you weird for wanting to recycle, you're like, what's going on here? There's like a cultural disconnect. Well, that's it. That's the cultural disconnect. So anyways, you do that, but then you start to study more. And as you get more experience, you start to question some of these memes, and then you start to actually rederive them from your own direct experiences. And sometimes what you discover is that, this meme went too far. It was too idealistic. It was just a philosophy. It was just an idea. It wasn't really connected or grounded in anything. And then, so maybe you go into business, you start a business and you realize, capitalism is not this evil thing that these green, socialists, told me it was. When I started actually doing it, I realized, business is actually very difficult. It is a survival game. And there's pros and cons to it. It's much more nuanced than just simply, earning a profit is evil. Mm-hmm. It's much more complicated than that. And so now you kind of almost regress a stage, but you're not really regressing. It's that you're sort of deepening your understanding of each stage. Each stage is very deep. And you can even go back to blue, for example. You might start to run your business, and you might realize, like, I have difficulty waking up in the morning and disciplining myself to work on my business because I'm kind of lazy and I want to play video games and so forth. And then you realize, that's because I'm missing important aspects from stage blue, which is also what Jordan Peterson this is what he sort of preaches positively, is all the positive aspects of stage blue, which is discipline, morality, ethics, character, loyalty, doing the hard work rather than playing games and stuff like that. And so you adopt some of those attitudes that you were missing because you grew up in an environment that didn't really teach you blue properly. And then you integrate that. And so the whole idea with this model is that it can help you to integrate these different important foundational aspects of your psyche. And it's not that one stage is better than another stage. It's that every stage builds on top of the other stage.
It also sounds
you're not abandoning blue or orange when you go green if you do it properly. You're integrating them. And there are healthy and unhealthy ways of manifesting these different memes and stages. You can go too far and they can become toxic. And this is what all the culture war these days is about in our political discussions, is it's all about each side is basically blaming the other side's excesses and toxic aspects while ignoring the healthy aspects.
Yeah, it sounds like from what I'm hearing from you is that, at least in my own life, there's been value towards re-deriving the principles and values of each stage firsthand as opposed to being lectured about them, which was, my understanding of everything up until I was out there in the world doing it was as it was told to me. There was very little firsthand, let me try this out and bang into something and see, oh, that's why discipline's important, or, oh, that's why capitalism is important, or, oh, that's why even social justice is important. It was much more, they were, as you said, not really like green in college, as I look back on it, was not a deep understanding of the inequality in the world and a self-reflective nature. It was almost this blue, and by blue I mean like dogmatic,
yes,
fit in, all pray to the same God, and that God just happened to be named multiculturalism or wokeness. And so I guess where I am at in my own life, and I think it feels appropriate, especially with some of the psychedelic, is like I got to go do green the right way. Like I got to go rederive it for myself, because I did travel and I did do these things, and I see intellectually the value of a lot of these things, but I do think I need to land in it, as cheesy as it sounds, and I would never have used this phrase, from a heart first, heart-centered place, which is not where I was coming from, and I don't think where a lot of the rhetoric around wokeness and social justice is often coming from.
Yeah, that's green is actually a very deep stage, and I experienced a very similar thing to you. Is that even though I sort of grew up in the green culture in Southern California, I didn't really embody it or integrate it very deeply. And really, when I started doing business and personal development, I was really at orange. I was very materialistic. I wanted success. I wanted money. I wanted sex and these sorts of things. And I spent a good 5-10 years doing that, sort of exhausting myself on that until I saw the limitations of that. And that's what happens with each of these stages, is that you if you work hard on it for 5 or 10 years, eventually you exhaust it. You sort of you start to master it. You start to familiarize yourself with it. You get comfortable with it, and then you get so comfortable that it gets boring, and you start asking yourself, well, what's next? There has to be more to life. I'm not just satisfied, earning money and having sex. I need something more. And then you can discover the next stage, and then start the whole process all over again. But yeah, what I realize is that every one of these stages is much deeper than we think. And that no matter how high you think you are on the spiral, you will benefit from going backwards and integrating even the very low stages, like even stage red. Sometimes it's appropriate to get angry and to know how to use your anger in a healthy way, not a toxic way, or how to be dominant. Dominance is not just a negative quality. There are positive, healthy aspects to dominance. For example, with leadership and so forth, it can be effective. Also, it depends on what environment you're in. Like if you're surviving in a prison environment, you're going to need a lot of red. Oh boy, you want to learn red? Go to prison for a few years. Try surviving in prison, and you will have a much deeper appreciation of stage red.
I think one of the unfortunate aspects, just of I can't blame the model, but the ego, is that I've even seen you have message boards, and I went to see where people tried to rank themselves, and it's just a bunch of yellow turquoises, which is to say, it's everybody's at the end of the spiral. I sense that own tendency in myself as you hear these stages, and you really want to be as far along as possible. But I think, to your point, I'd never considered it, but like just going to the first ones and being like, what was I really supposed to get from red or blue? And did I deeply experience that? Because I think that red is probably one that is not well integrated for most people in society. Like the value of anger and the idea that it is appropriate in certain contexts is a novel concept and certainly a novel feeling to many people, because it either explodes out of them at the wrong time or they can't handle it. And I sometimes include myself in that.
I practiced some red recently. I was at the dentist like a month ago, and I spent all this time. I spent like 3 months working with the dentist to fix a tooth, and I went there like 10 times, and he just kept getting it wrong every time. Finally, I got so frustrated with the whole situation, I wanted a refund, and then he refused to give me a refund because he already did so many attempts. And I'm just like, okay, I'm pulling red on this. I'm pulling red on this fucker. So I just like got in like a big heated argument. I even started like bashing down on his door because he literally like he walked away from me. He refused to have a conversation with me and like locked himself in his office. And I just started banging on his door. Like everybody in the office just freaked the fuck out, like to the point where like they thought like some violence was going to happen here, so that like they were ready to call the police on me.
Oh jeez.
But anyways, I walked out of there with a refund, and I felt good about it. And,
so
I felt very alive because I'm like, yeah, I exercised red at the appropriate time. Now, keep in mind, I did this in a sort of semi-conscious way, in the sense that like I knew what I was getting into. I was calibrated about it. I didn't completely, let myself go. I was still reasonable. We were able to have a conversation and kind of discuss things peacefully after he opened his door. And also, this was after many other attempts of trying to resolve the situation in a more conscious way, right? So I wouldn't resort to that method right off the bat. That's like a last resort. And see, sometimes in a survival situation sort of breaks down to the point where you can't reason with a person, or you can't use conscious means, in which case you use physical means. That's the original way we resolve our problems, is physically.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So to summarize, you would say, how does one know when it is appropriate to tap into lower stages? Is it partially while remaining conscious? What is your perspective on that? Well,
of course you can also lapse in consciousness. I mean, I was also frustrated and angry. I was legitimately angry to a certain degree. But yeah, I mean, the Zen even talk about enlightened anger. One of the mistakes people make when they learn about spirituality is they think, oh, well, if you're all loving and you're godlike and you're spiritual, then you're supposed to be this, turn the other cheek doormat, sort of like Jesus figure who never gets angry, never yells at people, never cusses, never does this sort of. This is sort of a silly caricature of what a truly conscious person behaves like. A truly conscious person isn't limited to that. A truly conscious person actually has an expanded range of all of his emotions and capacities, such that he can use what is appropriate in the situation. It's very contextual, mm-hmm. Right? So, like, if I was in a prison environment, I would have to sort of act a little bit more tough than what I would normally act like when I'm with you. Because it's a very different situation to be in a prison environment versus being in a hippie commune. When you're in a hippie commune, you can give each other hugs and kisses and give praises to each other, and that works well, but it doesn't work well in a prison environment. You won't survive in a prison environment this way.
Got it. Awesome.
Because Stage Red respects strength. So if you act like a hippie in a prison environment, they're going to not respect you and they're going to bully you. But if you walk into a prison and like punch someone in the face on your first day, that establishes your strength, and then they will actually respect you for that. And then they
imagine don't punch someone on the face. just put on a mean mug. Maybe get some angry tattoos or something. But awesome. I know Justin's about to hit rush hour traffic, so I want to save him so we can wind down and momentarily. But there's a lot of topics that we've touched on, and I'll just say. Leo on his channel has videos far longer than this podcast will be. So if any of the stuff is of interest to anyone who has listened, Spiral Dynamics, he's got probably a 2+ hour video on each stage. If that's of interest to you, he's got his take on determinism, God, love, which we just scratched in this. So if you're watching any of this and you want to check it out, it's actualize.org. You've got very easily accessible titles. They're not clickbait, so you can easily catalog what you're looking for. Unlike our channel, where everything is about it's the same title 100 times with the different topics. But is there anything that you wanted to touch on before winding down?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much more we could talk about. Maybe in the future we can dive deeper into all these topics. Yeah, the difficulty in discussing this stuff is that it starts to, all the threads start to kind of unravel, and there's so many threads that we could follow, and they all lead into interesting directions, and then ultimately they all interconnect together. So I guess the most important thing is to realize here that this is not about speculating about the nature of existence. It's not about building an ideology. It's really a deconstructive process. You're deconstructing your mind by self-reflecting, by contemplating, and by noticing how your mind works. Really, if you want to boil down what this work is about, it's simply about observation. You sit and you observe yourself very carefully, very neutrally, objectively, without any kind of biases. You observe, why do I crave that thing? Why do I fear this thing? Why does this make me angry? Why do I have these doubts? Why do I believe in science? Why do I believe in religion? Where did my beliefs and ideas come from? And all of this, and then you start to question this more and more and more, and you do this very patiently over a process of years and decades. And as you do this, you actually discover certain patterns in how stuff works. You learn how your own mind works, and this gets you closer to truth. And it's also very practical, because as it turns out, you have a lot of patterns that you've developed unconsciously, beliefs and ideas and assumptions that you've picked up from your environment, which are not serving you very well and are holding you back from reaching higher levels of success, happiness, relationship stability, and so forth. Because the truth is that the thing that is most problematic in all these different areas of your life, whether it's business, money, sexual relationships, friendships, politics, it's your own freaking selfishness. That's what's getting in the way. You're getting in your own way. There's nothing but you getting in your own way. So the solution to that, of course, is to self-reflect and to start to notice how you're getting in your own way. And if you take this to a very radical extent for decades, maybe with the help of psychedelics as well, you can reach some of these crazy things that I've been talking about that right now for you might seem like they're just, some woo-woo wishful thinking stuff, but you can reach, crazy levels of love and so forth, but it takes a lot of shedding of the old ego self layers in order to get there. So the work can be practical right now. You don't need to wait 20 years to get results, but you should also know that if you do this work for 20 years, you invest a lot into it, there are enormous payoffs that you can't even imagine yet that are waiting for you. It's just a question of how serious are you about doing it? How much do you want it?
Yeah. What's interesting is that even this, and I'm aware, which is not a problem with it, but even this conversation, for everyone listening, from their perspective, this is the map and not the territory, which is to say, don't take my word, don't take Leo words, and I know you'd agree with me. If you want, head in the direction that either of us has pointed at various times and test various methods for yourself of knowing, understanding, and experiencing, but don't let the preconceived notion of what stage you're in or what you'll find when you're on a psychedelic or any of that get in the way, because this is the map. At the best case, it's a map drawn from Leo's experience and my own, but it's not even necessarily the map that you will draw, and it is certainly not the territory that you are and will experience.
Yeah, that's very important. Everyone's journey through life and self-awareness is going to be quite different because we face different survival challenges and we have different fears and desires and cravings and needs and so forth, and we're at different stations in life. So no method or technique works for everybody. So really, my suggestion for you, if you want to get serious about this work, is don't adopt anything as a belief, and don't stick to any one teacher or teaching, and not even my own words. Don't stick with that. Really, to keep yourself safe, sort of approach it as a science of the self. You're going to be doing science on yourself. You don't even know what the method is that you're going to be using yet. Be open about the method. Experiment with different methods. Read different books. Watch different channels, different videos. Explore. Cross-reference different sources. What you'll notice is that this keeps you safe. This keeps you from getting trapped into one sort of cul-de-sac of ideology, or one belief system, or one spiritual tradition, or one paradigm or another. one set of assumptions or memes or whatever, but like just be very open to experimenting throughout this entire process. And as you're cross-referencing stuff, your mind will put the pieces together. Slowly, the pieces will start to assemble, and you will start to understand what the hell is really going on in life. And that is perhaps one of the most satisfying things that I'm most passionate about as a result of this work, is just how deeply you are able to understand life. It's so satisfying. Not only is it useful, but it's extremely sad, because most people don't know how confused they are about what's going on. Like, they don't know what's going on in politics. They don't know why terrorism exists, why there's mass shootings, why people don't get along, why there's debates on YouTube. Like, all this stuff is happening around them, why they have fights with their family, why they can't make money, and like why they can't maintain a relationship. But all of this starts to become clear the more you do this work, and then it just gives you a sort of a peace of mind.
Awesome. Let's wind down there, man. Thank you for reaching out. I enjoyed our conversation.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.